Good morning and welcome to Rising. I'm Amber Duke here with Jessica Burbank, and we have a lot to get into today. Obviously a very historic day with our first ever president, former president, being a convicted felon.
Yeah, I came into the studio today and I wished everyone happy Trump Day, and also everyone should wish Amber a happy birthday tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. That's nice.
Yes, let's get into it. History was made Thursday as former President Donald Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts in a hush-money trial. 12 jurors deliberated for 2 days. And for the first time ever, an ex-president and GOP candidate is now a convicted felon. Crowds who were in front of the courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. Social media went wild as soon as the verdict came out Thursday afternoon. Actress Vivica Fox took to X saying, "Got him," followed by clown and clapping hands emoticons. Actor Steve Martin posted, quote, "Today would be a good day for the GOP members to engage in serious self-reflection about their devotion to a convicted felon." California Congressman Ro Khanna posted, quote, "The 2024 election now comes down to this. Do you want a convicted felon in the White House, or do you want Scranton Joe, who fights and delivers for working families every day?" Hillary Clinton, who lost to Trump in 2016, was speaking to a women's empowerment organization in the nation's capital. Let's listen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anything going on today?
Meanwhile, people on the right side of the aisle were furious. On X, Tucker Carlson wrote, quote, "Import the third world, become the third world. That's what we just saw. This won't stop Trump. He'll win the election if he's not killed first, but it does mark the end of the fairest justice system in the world. Anyone who defends this verdict is a danger to you and your family." Meanwhile, Elon Musk posted, quote, "Indeed, great damage was done today to the public's faith in the American legal system. If a former president can be criminally convicted over such a trivial matter motivated by politics rather than justice, then anyone is at risk of a similar fate." Piers Morgan said, "This is a sad, shameful, and ridiculous day for America. To drag a former president who is running for president again through criminal courts over something so trivial feels a massive overreach and an incredibly divisive and obviously politically partisan action." Georgia Congresswoman and ardent Trump supporter Marjorie Taylor Greene posted, quote, "Radical leftists and deep state operatives have been orchestrating this sham trial from the beginning. You don't see this level of corruption in a banana republic, but it's happening in our own backyard." Some very disparate reactions there, and we could see that, of course, in the reaction outside of the courthouse, where half of the crowd was cheering in favor of the verdict and half was obviously very upset and angrily protesting the verdict. Because this has been one of the most divisive trials and obviously a historic trial with this 34-count conviction. I will say, I think from the conservative side, people are probably disturbed by it, but not surprised. It seemed like the most likely outcome that this would either be a conviction or a hung jury. I don't think anyone believed that a juror of 12 Manhattanites was ever going to acquit the president.
Right, yeah, I don't know. It's his home state. I'm glad it was, a jury of his peers. A lot of people in the U.S. court systems don't get that in today's America. That's supposed to be a right to everyone in the United States. So thankfully, this wasn't George Soros. It wasn't the Biden administration's conviction, as we just heard Amy talk about. This was a conviction that happened thanks to a jury of his peers, and they deliberated for a long time. And I think it being a unanimous decision and that being a necessity is important. I think it suggests that the evidence was very clear. There are, of course, a lot of people who are saying this trial was unfair, and they have reasons for that, but it was as fair as a trial gets in the United States. There are a lot of people who are very upset about how our justice system operates on a day-to-day basis. There's a reason I always say law and justice are not the same, but it's in the direction of who can afford a good private attorney? Donald Trump is one of the people the justice system works for at the expense of others, given how much money he can throw at attorneys. So to see conviction for a very wealthy, powerful person is a good thing to some extent. People taking this and saying, he should not be able to run because anyone, who's convicted of a felony should not be allowed to participate in our democracy ever again. Of course I disagree with that. But I think in this case, people are going to have to grapple with the fact that they're voting for a president who gave hush money to this woman. I would not say that's a trivial pursuit, as Piers Morgan would say. That's something that feels very wrong to me. That's not someone I would ever want to vote for.
Yeah, but that's outside of what he was actually convicted of. Paying hush money to a porn star is obviously not illegal. What's at stake here and what was demonstrated, or the prosecution attempted to demonstrate, I think they failed. The jury obviously disagreed. What they attempted to demonstrate was that not only did Trump make this payment, but that he hid what the payment was through a marking the books as a legal expense as opposed to a campaign expense, in furtherance of violating federal election law, in furtherance of covering up another crime. So this is a three-tiered allegation here. And what was, I think, fundamentally unfair about the actual charges that were brought against the president is that this underlying crime was never actually defined by the prosecution until they got to closing arguments. So not only did they elevate what was typically a misdemeanor, which is falsifying business records, to a felony by saying that he did it in furtherance of violating federal election law, which obviously the state of New York shouldn't even have jurisdiction over, but then they said he also was covering up this third unnamed crime that we're not going to talk about and we don't have to prove at any point in the case, but we're not even going to talk about and say what the options are until we get to the closing arguments, which in New York, for whatever reason, the prosecution goes second, which typically the defense would go second during closing arguments and get the last word. They ended up saying that the three underlying crimes were tax evasion, falsifying business records, again, so a circular crime, apparently, falsifying business records to cover up a campaign finance violation, to cover up falsifying business records. It doesn't make any sense. And then the third reason was to basically interfere with the campaign. So those were the three underlying crimes that they brought forward in the closing arguments. Didn't have to prove any of them, and the judge explicitly instructed the jury that they didn't even have to agree on which underlying crime they believe Trump committed. So they could say, 4 of us believe that he falsified the business records to hide tax evasion. 4 of us believe he falsified the business records to hide that he falsified business records. And 4 of us believe that he did it to violate campaign finance law. So 4 disagree on what the underlying crime was, which is the predicate crime for the misdemeanor of falsifying business records, and that would be considered a unanimous decision. So we don't even really know what the jury returned in terms of what they believe that underlying crime was. There's a lot more to this case that was fundamentally unfair, going through DA Bragg, Judge Merchan, the type of evidence that was allowed to be introduced, and I'm sure we're going to get into it, but obviously want to kick it over to your response, so I'm not filibustering.
Yeah, I think when we look at the court proceedings, the most important part to me, of course, is the jury deliberation. Each side, the defense and prosecution, has their opportunity to have witnesses called to the stand. They make their opening and closing arguments. You know, the judge determines what is allowed and what is not allowed based on the objections of opposing counsel. But at the end of the day, they hear the arguments, and the jury goes behind closed doors and reviews all of the evidence, which, you know, was the evidence that led to the conviction. That's the most important part. To me, it doesn't matter as much if every detail of the crime was mentioned by the prosecution. Typically, the judge instructs the jury on how to make a decision based on the evidence, what would qualify as a certain conviction or not. And then they get behind closed doors, and the jurors review the 12 invoices, or 11 invoices, 12 vouchers, and 11 checks. And each of the documents that they reviewed accounted for one of the charges in which Trump was found guilty. There were 34 documents. And so based on the evidence, they made their decision. That's what matters to me. That's how I think most cases should happen. I think it's wrong that there are cases in the United States where you have an argument between a defense attorney, the prosecutor, and then the judge makes a decision. I think in every single legal decision of consequence, whether it's one of jail time before an official trial and it's an arraignment, you should have a jury present. And I think it's, you know, a travesty that we don't in the US, where you're supposed to. So I really think the important part was the jury deliberation, where they reviewed the evidence and had their conversation.
I think the problem is that the jury, first of all, didn't get to access all of the evidence that the defense did want to introduce. Key being the FEC expert that they wanted to talk about the underlying crime, which is this federal one, well, part of it was the federal crime, which was the violation of the federal election law. So they actually wanted a former commissioner of the FEC to be able to testify to whether or not this actually was a violation of that law, because the state is relying on that for its predicate crime. And the judge said that they weren't allowed to do that. The FEC commissioner was only allowed to talk about a 30,000-foot view of what election law actually is and not how it applied to this specific case. So they weren't even allowed to really hear what this expert had to say about this very important part of the case. Stormy Daniels was able to introduce a lot of, she was a smear merchant on the stand. She got to introduce so-called evidence that Trump and her had a non-consensual affair, essentially smearing him as a sexual predator and a sexual assaulter. The judge allowed that to go into evidence. He also explicitly instructed the jury that even if they didn't believe some of Michael Cohen's testimony, they could ignore that and pick and choose which parts of his testimony they believed, even though, again, this is a convicted perjurer, convicted liar who also lied during Trump's civil trial, where he claimed that even though he pleaded guilty to tax evasion and lying to Congress, that he didn't actually do those things. And the defense never even got the opportunity to defend against the predicate crime because, again, it wasn't brought up until closing arguments, during which the prosecution went second. And then separate from all of that, we have DA Alvin Bragg, who ran on the idea of prosecuting Trump, which is against the Constitution. Okay, so we don't prosecute people, we don't investigate people, we investigate and prosecute crimes. And by him admitting in his campaign that he specifically wanted to go after Trump, that is a violation of Trump's due process. Then you have this judge who previously donated to President Joe Biden. His daughter has raised $93 million plus for Democratic clients through a consulting firm that she owns, in part based on this case. They literally ran ads fundraising for her clients about the fact that her father was presiding over this criminal trial against the president. He repeatedly put a gag order on Trump, saying that he wasn't allowed to talk about Michael Cohen, about the prosecution, as Michael Cohen had a podcast where he would put up images of Donald Trump in an orange jumpsuit behind bars and talk about how he was a horrible human being who needed to go to jail. I mean, the list goes on. I have it all here in front of me, and again, it would probably take 2 hours for me to go through everything that was wrong in this case, but the idea that this was just a simple jury trial, the jury got to see all of the evidence, they reached the right decision. This thing was fundamentally stacked from the start against the president. It should have never been brought in the first place. They used a bizarre legal theory to elevate this from a misdemeanor to a felony. They expanded the statute of limitations by saying that the years that Trump was living in Florida didn't count, so therefore they were still allowed to bring the case. I mean, I don't see a single step of this that was done in a just manner.
It's interesting because as someone who's spent a lot of time like in arraignments in the legal system, doing research about what's wrong with our cash bail system, I spent a lot of time in the courts in the U.S., and it sounds to me like a lot of the criticisms of the Trump trial, not just yours, but in general, are criticisms that can apply to most criminal cases in the United States. So expert testimony, typically an expert is not asked what their opinion would be in a specific case. They're called to the stand to offer their expert opinion. Were the proper scientific methods used? Were the proper, application of the laws used? Can they explain what the law is? Can they explain details about what goes on behind the scenes in election spending reporting? That sort of thing. They're not there to say, if I were you, jury, this is what you should decide. And so to me, it sounds like the expert testimony that was allowed or denied was within the typical scope.
Yeah, but he wasn't even allowed to talk about what I'm saying is he wasn't even allowed to talk about the specifics of the law. He was only allowed to give like a 30,000-foot view of.
Well, that's the job of the judge and the attorneys in a case like this, and so they're allowed to provide. But in any expert testimony, they're allowed to provide their opinion based on their specialized education and training. So that's their relevant role in any criminal trial, not just Trump's trial. The testimony about who Trump is he a good guy or not, character testimony and calling character witnesses to the stand, to testify to who the defendant is. What is their character? That's typical in criminal proceedings as well. That's not unique to the Trump trial.
But Stormy wasn't a character witness. She was supposed to be a fact witness about the fact that they had an affair and whether or not the payment was made for her to sign an NDA. And she introduced these very explicit details within the affair regarding their actual sexual encounter and implied that Trump had sexually assaulted her because she supposedly blacked out during the incident, something which she's never said before, by the way. And even when the defense did object during some parts of her testimony, the judge did sustain those objections, but there was a lot of other specifics in her testimony that was allowed to go into evidence that included these comments that, well, you know, it might not have been totally consensual. I mean, that's poisoning the jury pool.
Witness testimony in any case, in a criminal case, is not always going to be favorable to the defendant. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it's very damning for the defendant. That, again, is typical of most criminal proceedings. So I think a lot of the criticisms of the Trump criminal trial are criticisms that people should have with every single criminal proceeding if they're genuine. And these are all criticisms I have. I think our court system should be a lot more fair than it is. And I don't think these criticisms are unique to Trump's trial.
All right, well, we're going to have to keep covering this, obviously, throughout the show. We're going to take a break, be back with more Rising after this.